everybody. Welcome to SCI-Arc's Wednesday evening lecture. I'm Genik, and I'm really glad to see people rolling in. I think we have a real treat for us this evening. And I think that the discourse on identities is a really complex one, and our guest is one that's helped kind of solve through the difficulties and the promise of establishing boundaries and kind of new territories within that discussion. In a world of ephemeral boundaries of wiki and Facebook communities, of avatars of the self in unspecified and imprecise and mutable geographies, what is the geography of the self? Where are the self's boundaries and its constituencies, and where do its communities lie? In a simple question, what are the architectures of the self in a world of ephemeral, changing limits? To our speaker this evening, the potential of a space in between and of boundaries is a kind of traumatic subject, a debate oscillating between the authority of the debate of identity and its displacement, and the various supra-debates of authority and its subjects. In his critique, Teddy Cruz affirms that the instability brought on by the trans-border movement of migrant populations engenders a kind of convulsion of identities and of communities, a condition that puts at risk the very humanistic capacity of architecture even to thrive. His fully armed counter-critique emerges from this microdynamic that can shape neighborhoods and communities. It is there that the battle is fought, identities moved, and geographies lost and once again reclaimed. As we zoom out from the San Diego and Tijuana borders where he works, to a broader, more global condition, are the trans-border populations of India, of Pakistan, of China, and of Burma, and their struggle to find firm foothold in new lands put at risk the very project of architecture, and are the forces at play beyond the economic and political to ones which mirror and make the inevitability of the movement of markets ultimately predict the fate and realization of the individual. But it is also from within this critique that Teddy Cruz finds the very means to make architecture a promise and a move. This has put him not only in the front of us this evening, but also within a kind of national discourse on risk, opportunity, and the realization of the ever-shifting dream of ourselves. Teddy Cruz and his trans-border practice is based in San Diego and Tijuana, two worlds worthy of the best of Jonathan Swift and Gulliver's and his travels. He has been recognized for his proposals for architecture awards for the Architectural League of New York, and brought his voice to the discourse of New York Times, Log, Progressive Architecture, the San Diego Union, and the Los Angeles Times. Teddy Cruz's voice is a commitment, one in a way that architecture often shies away from today. For sure, this has been evident in debates taken on in Other, at the Instituto de Baja California, and in massive change at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago. Teddy Cruz is currently Associate Professor in Public Culture and Urbanism in the Visual Arts Department, a trans-border place in of itself, at the University of California, San Diego. Por favor, den la bienvenida al Profesor Teddy Cruz.
So SCI-Arc students, where are they? They should go and get them.
They're on their way from the studios.
Anyway, I should dive, and thank you, Chris, thank you for the invitation, and it's so amazing in a way to be back at SCI-Arc, and I wanted to begin where I left it, here, already a few years ago. 1999 was the last time I was at SCI-Arc, when he was not yet here, of course. But I wanted to begin with these images because somehow they became emblematic of how the story unfolded, and at some point, in fact, Denise Bratton referred to these border postcards that we produced here at SCI-Arc, again many years ago, as anticipatory of what really how the practice developed in its entry into the politics of density, the trans-border urban dynamics that have been such an inspiration for our work. And in fact, these images, which were constructed by students as a kind of euphoric participatory energy, which SCI-Arc in those days was definitely incredibly intensive and inspiring to me. So I taught a studio called LA, La La Land. But it was basically, it stood for Latin America Los Angeles. And the effort, of course, was to suggest, on one hand, that Los Angeles was a second city, or a double city. At that point, the interest in understanding the impact of immigration in the transformation of the American metropolis was already unfolding in my own desire, I think, as an architect. But ultimately, the larger critique was to suggest that Los Angeles did not end where its administrative boundaries ended. That probably Los Angeles begins in the middle of Tijuana and ends in the Castro or Mission district in San Francisco. And in so doing, the questioning of very cliches about what city is, now that we are all interested once more in returning to the city as a laboratory of ideas. So these images were constructed basically with leftover photographic pieces of students collecting leftover spaces in infrastructures, marginal spaces of Los Angeles, San Diego, and Tijuana, and collectively back at SCI-Arc we would stitch them into these large sort of relational maps or visual narratives. I mean, they were really emblematic of a desire and to understand the territory, this Southern California, Baja California territory, as the, in fact, laboratory for thinking of the 21st century city. So I never imagined, in fact, that these, again, images that, again, would be anticipatory or, in a way, visual manifestos of sorts of the interest in returning to understanding the multiplicity of forces that shape ultimately the territory, and as architects we've been so distant. The sociopolitical and economic dynamics that are ultimately in front of our very eyes transforming the city itself and the territory. So I never imagined that that was going to be the beginning of a journey to go not only deeper into the territory of work, really where I live and work, the border itself, but to really zoom out to the world and back many times. And so I would like to share with you, in fact, many of these stories, because for me, going back to SCI-Arc is a special moment, so I hope you're patient as I take you through a series of narratives. And now let's begin with this one, which in fact has been of interest to me, even though hopefully next Tuesday things will change and maybe I can throw away this PowerPoint and deal with so many other issues. But the cover of this book, this edition of Empire by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, at some point became an interesting sort of device to play in some ideas. Really going through this book and Antonio Negri suggesting, of course, that the diminishing political power of the nation state in front of our very eyes again is occurring because of these again, transnational economic flows, establishing somehow a very different idea of sovereignty, not to do with the nation state per se, but at a global scale. But it's interesting to imagine that this book was published 6 months before 9/11. I kept thinking, my God, probably after this event, this catastrophic event that changed the course of things, chunks of this book, as much as I love this book and its authors in a sense, the perspective that they really brought into the rhetoric of globalization, many of these chunks of this book are obsolete. Because after 9/11, after the debris of that unfortunate event began to clear, a different world was once more revealed. A world divided by the clash of nations and of ideologies, and the division of jurisdictions and communities at the scale of the hemisphere. This is where I began to play with this notion, in fact with Denise Bratton as well, that has to do with this global border, or what we ended up calling a political equator. I once in my office decided, and this is very much relevant for many SCI-Arc students, because I mean, the implication of our own markings as they really have repercussions at a global scale. In other words, I asked myself, what would happen if I was to trace an imaginary line that would depart from the very place where I live and work, the Tijuana-San Diego border, and I would trace this line across the world atlas? What would occur? So what emerged was something that I ended up calling the political equator, as I realized that this line basically intersected a variety of critical thresholds across the world, aligning itself closely to a corridor of conflict, of global conflict between the 28th and 32 degrees parallel. also aligning itself with the discovery of a diagram emerging from a book called The Pentagon's New Map, by which the Pentagon conveys that the world atlas is once more divided between what used to be the third world and the first worlds. Now the Pentagon calls it the division between the non-integrating gap, as it calls the dysfunctional families of the Southern Hemisphere, the global South, where terrorism might be harbored, versus the functioning core, of course, speaking of the strong economies of the primarily Northern Hemisphere. I begin to realize that along this border, this global border, this political equator, is where some of the most contested, dramatic, socio-political and economic dynamics are at play, conveyed in my imagination as a series of journeys across hemispheres. On one hand, the unprecedented flow of migration of people coming from the non-integrating gap in search of the strong economies or the functioning core, and in the opposite direction, in fact, out of the reorganization of the means of production, multinationals, out of the politics of outsourcing, deploying themselves in search from the functioning core, in search for the cheap labor markets of the non-integrating gap. I realized that as the diasporas of Latin America, Asia, and Africa settle in many European, North American cities in the United States and Canada, they begin to generate an amount of capital that is invisible in a sense. Informal subsidies, remittances that are sent back to the countries and villages of origin of these diasporas. I mean, already last year, I don't know, after the market, the collapse of the market recently, this amounted, at least for Mexico, amounted to $20 billion that immigrants, Mexican immigrants, sent back to the country and to the villages of origin. I mean, that money is still up for grabs. Where does it end up, of course? What impact does it have on the transformation, the physical transformation of those environments? And ultimately, finally, along this intuitive, arbitrary line, in a sense, it intersected, finally, in my mind, in my eyes, I mean, to see visually a series of critical thresholds, border checkpoints, beginning with the one that is the most trafficked one where I live and work, the San Diego-Tijuana border on the west, picking up the Strait of Gibraltar at Ceuta and Melilla, which is the main funnel of migration from North Africa into Europe, even the Palestinian-Israeli border, and all the way to the other end of the world, dissecting also the dramatic transformation of the Chinese metropoli, equally out of urbanities of labor and surveillance. Let's not forget that. So I think that this notion of global conflict begins to allow an architect, a designer, all of us, to rethink the role, to rethink our role as architects, in not only understanding the geopolitics and geoeconomies that are really transforming the very territory, but allows us also to dive into the territory itself once more. The idea that the Tijuana-San Diego border, for me, has become a laboratory to witness, in fact, a territory, a very unique territory. No other place in the world, probably, you would find compressed in a few linear miles the politics of surveillance and labor and immigration, the tensions of formal and informal urbanisms, the struggles between density and sprawl, and ultimately, no other place in the world you would find some of the wealthiest real estate as the one found in San Diego's North County, barely 20 minutes away from some of the poorest settlements in Latin America. This radical proximity of mega wealth and poverty, the sectors of poverty that surround it, is really what is defining more and more every city in the world. So the radicalization of the local, the understanding of the power imprinted in the territory, becomes once more a material for design. It becomes once more a material for the architect. So let me, for a moment, shift into this image. I'm really low tech, I'm sorry about this, but this yielded a project that is in progress, in a sense, and it has to do with constructing a photographic section of 60 linear miles between San Diego and Tijuana. This image was recently displayed at the Venice Biennale. In fact, it occupied the whole facade of the US Pavilion. It's an amazing treat for me to transport the border image and to be the facade of the US Pavilion, 90 feet long by 15 feet high. So 60 linear miles. It's called Radicalizing the Local, 60 linear miles of transborder conflict. And basically, it was simply a way of navigating this territory, beginning 30 miles deep into San Diego and ending 30 miles into Tijuana, and identifying along the course of this section a series of collisions between top-down development, bottom-up social and ecological networks, and so on. Beginning again with 30 miles into San Diego, the conflict, series of conflicts along the territory. The conflict between top-down development and the topography, the conflict between large infrastructure and the watershed, the conflict between, ultimately, gated communities and everyday life, or as Rebecca Solnit called it, the apartheid of everyday life, the conflict between military zones and environmental protected areas, and this is an ironic part of Southern California. It's the only places where there is no development. The environmental protected zones is where the military bases are. The conflict between the formal and informal in some of Southern California's neighborhoods that have been retrofitted by immigrants. The conflict, of course, between two cities that repel each other as well as they juxtapose simultaneously. And just entering Tijuana, one of the most fundamental conflicts or collisions as the Tijuana River enters into San Diego, the only place where the wall is separated. This huge concrete channel pierces the wall and then disappears into the Tijuana estuary. The conflict between the river and the border, the conflict between informal urbanisms and natural ecologies, the conflict between emergency housing, factories, and labor, the conflict between density and sprawl also in Tijuana, and once the wall reaches the Pacific Ocean and finally sinks, the mama of all conflicts, the conflicts between the political and the natural. The argument in my mind is that architectural practice needs to reposition itself, enter into that conflict, positioning ourselves in the midst of those collisions, to unpack, to open up, to expose conflict as an operational device to transform our very procedures. And so this yielded a second image that I want to show you before getting to the PowerPoint again. We're really low tech here. And it's an exercise that I gave myself. If I was to actually speak of what my practice attempts to do, what is its desire? What is my desire? How ideally this practice would be positioning itself in the midst of these conflicts. I drew this very naive, in a sense, very direct diagram that would speak of this repositioning, but also of the procedures that would have to be altered in order to enter into this problematic. And of course, there is no other moment in the history, probably, of this country to be preoccupied with these issues, with conflict itself, with crisis. Unprecedented crisis of environmental sustainability, unprecedented crisis of public infrastructure, unprecedented crisis of institutional collaborations, of socioeconomic sustainability, of housing affordability, of political engagement. So conflict itself becomes, again, the device. Practice and research expose conflict, again, as an operational tool. And by that I mean we need to understand what produced that conflict in the first place. What is producing the crisis of affordability? What is producing, ultimately, much of these conditions? So the practice then becomes engaged, possibly, in my case, on a series of translations, possibly. The exposure of territorial conflict, probably targeting two main areas of study in my case. Conditions of ownership, who owns the resources after it, and whose territory is it? In other words, political jurisdiction. That no intervention into the territory can occur without addressing conditions of ownership, recognizing who owns the resources, who benefits, and on the other, again, whose territory is it. After this, the engagement has been in understanding that our city is not only fragmented in this archipelago of voids, but actually the institutions are also fragmented. So fragmented policies, resources, and budgets. It's not that there is no money or that the problem is that there is no money. There is a lot of money out there, but it's stupidly managed as these budgets, institutions, and again, and resources are completely divided. So how can architects ultimately enter into this problematic, and besides designing buildings, which is what we do, can we participate in the designing of the redistribution of resources and collaborations to produce, hopefully, alternative economic performance? In other words, part of the again, this practice diagram I wanted to begin because it becomes the kind of, again, more tactical manifesto for the work that I will show you. But the engagement of producing alternative economic models, alternative markets and economies. Can a neighborhood be a developer of its own housing stock? Alternative policy frameworks, can density be understood as an amount of socio-economic exchanges per acre? And ultimately, alternative spatial tactics can form formal attitudes, anticipate social encounter. So this expanded model of practice and research suggests, of course, the role of the architect as mediator, as facilitator or mediator between top-down formal economic capital on one hand, and bottom-up informal social capital. Ultimately, the dish or the pan at the end of this diagram suggests that we must understand the value of the hidden dynamics in the territory, the informal economies and densities that are also shaping the city in front of our very eyes. So going back again to the territory, all of you, I imagine, hopefully being in SCI-Arc does not prevent you from traveling down to Tijuana, which is barely 2 hours away from here, to understand that this is the most trafficked border in the world. 60 million crossings annually. Not to mention the amount of goods and services that percolate through this funnel that are legal and illegal. And as many of you know, at this very moment in the last years after 9/11, an unprecedented flow of capital from Homeland Security to transform fundamentally the checkpoint that divides these two cities, further barricading San Diego from Tijuana, including what I've been noticing from Homeland Security, which are open pages, a matrix, again, of militarization at the border that convey tactics of control that are really defining the border ecology at this moment, ignoring every single environmental policy up to now, including the border calculus. I mean, I found this to be even more sophisticated than any diagram that I've seen from architectural schools, where the military is already anticipating the informal kind of passages, the anticipating unknown kind of activities and producing a very different approach to controlling these conditions. And further, that in the military bases themselves, they have began to construct what I've been calling mini Fallujahs. I mean, this is near San Diego, where they have built mock villages in the shape of Iraqi villages, even using high technology as these holograms that project Arab subjects on these walls. So ultimately, this intensification of militarization at the edge is very dramatic and continues to be very dramatic. In the last year, of course, very neatly packaging anti-terrorist agendas with anti-immigration agendas as well, that of course deploy in the rest of the territory a very dramatic alliance, which is nothing new again to the history of the city itself, an alliance between urbanization and militarization here, which of course is manifested and solidified by this water wall that transforms San Diego into the world's largest gated community. And of course, what I'm talking about is that in the last 30, 40 years, the border wall continues to harden. And in tandem, we have been noticing the hardening of a social legislation towards the city, of public and social institutions that divide and that expand the gap, the socioeconomic gap across jurisdictions and communities. Of course, an urbanism of fear, as the politics of fear that have dominated the political rhetoric in the last years. So, of course, the implications of these top-down systems of control also begin to generate transborder flows or tactics of transgression that encroach into that system of control and power that also define the border. So the border is not only defined by these attitudes of division that are unprecedented at this moment, but also by the flows that transcend that border, that barricade, and begin to suggest a very different idea of urbanization, defined in fact by social and economic temporal dynamics that are unbelievable to witness. And of course they are manifested physically. This is not an abstraction. So imagine a Tijuana developer that goes to San Diego to rescue small bungalows that are being demolished in the mid-city of San Diego because developers wanted to build larger condominium projects or mansions everywhere. And these houses are brought to the border. These are houses waiting to cross the border, so not only people cross the border, but in fact entire pieces of one city travel to the other. And when these houses are transferred to Tijuana, they are put on top of these steel frames, leaving the first the floor to be the second, and allowing it to be open-ended to be infilled with more house for a small business. This sort of layering of intensity, this intensive programmatic sort of juxtapositions is what really defines a very interesting condition. Of course, that has already, as anything, become a style. So this house was not imported from San Diego. It was built from scratch by its inhabitant, Tijuana, who wanted to bring together his two most precious dreams on one hand to build a replica of a big tract home from San Diego while maintaining his carriage shop beneath. So not only houses, but incredible amount of waste travels southbound as Tijuana builds itself with the waste of the other. So these are the tire walls that you have seen for decades, I think, but look at what people are doing now in conditions of social emergency. They have figured out how to dismantle that inert, small object, which is the tire, the rubber tire. They peel it off, they clip it, and they interlock it to create a very solid retaining wall. Or, of course, the pallet racks that constructing habitation and light infrastructure. And ultimately, the most famous of them all, of course, the garage doors that are brought from the riverside of San Diego to Tijuana to build the entire housing. So, of course, as much as I don't want to perpetuate or glorify or romanticize poverty, nevertheless, we cannot stop witnessing how in conditions of social emergency, creativity continues to flourish. But of course, I don't want to trivialize this. I want to understand primarily the conditions that really shape this very odd, surreal juxtaposition. So let's imagine, and I would like to offer again as a kind of explanation that it's been essential for the way we operate in our small practice to first notice a condition, an urban phenomenon that we continue somehow to ignore as architects. Let's notice those conditions, because from those conditions, a main conflict emerges. And it is that conflict that becomes the device to ignite and detonate a process. So conditions, conflict, and process in this case. So the condition in this case, showing you these images, is to imagine that the first ring of suburbanization of San Diego, a Levittown type, has in the last 30 years begun to dismantle itself. And its debris is being transferred 20 minutes south to construct the new periphery of Tijuana. Two different ideas of suburbia, very close to each other and yet incredibly different. So these transfers, or the recycling of Levittown into Tijuana's slums, is a fundamental dramatic condition. Once the waste is transferred into this, into Tijuana, as you know, as many of you know, it is organized either by urban pirates that are speculators also. It's not all benign. Slumlords or community activists that organize people en masse to invade public lands and incrementally through time shape this urbanism of emergency. People organize themselves, they request services from the municipality, water might be sent first, or second, an official line of electricity, expecting people to steal the rest. These are small, they're called little devils, as people clip illegally to this line of electricity. So in essence, I think this condition of social organization, of resources, of negotiation with boundaries within these environments shapes a very interesting urbanism. So I don't want to talk about the image of the informal. I've been known as this sort of bricolage, the guy that is just doing collages. And I'm interested to renew and advance, hopefully, the discussion of the informal to understand not its image, but its fundamental socio-political and economic procedures. What is behind that facade of poverty? And probably we could extract lessons that would allow us, once we abstract it, once we translate the hidden value in this into tactics and strategies of intervention in the official city. So this layering, of course, is an important aspect of all this. But not only the slums, But the importation and exportation of symbols of progress is what is defining every global city at this very moment. Who was going to imagine, in fact, that the urban code of Southern California was going to define the terms everywhere? This is the desire of everyone. These large mansions, these large private homes on large steroid parcels, including China. I'm sure you've seen some of these dramatic images that are emerging as these subdivisions outside Beijing are built as faithful replicas of their counterparts in Orange County with the cheap stock on aluminum windows. This dart is not Photoshop. This Orange County, China, is also what is constructing the new periphery of Tijuana, or any Latin American city for that matter, as now the Federal Housing Agency in Mexico, as in many of these countries, have privatized, in a sense, out of the kind of neoliberalization of the banking industry in Mexico. Private developers come now to build affordable social housing. And this is what developers are doing everywhere in Baja California. Thousands of little boxes as miniature replicas of their counterparts in San Diego, equipped with all the cliches. I call them mini-me's, because they are, these beige homes, unfortunately being built with a concrete block. 250 square feet houses for a small family, with its front yard, mini backyard, mini setback. But in the last years, we've been documenting, of course, how in conditions of social emergency, also these, which have become the desire of Tijuanans, begin to transform as the front yard is now occupied by a small shop, or maybe a house in the second floor. And pretty much this recycling of San Diego to Tijuana also is transforming these mini subdivisions into informal, complex systems of socioeconomic diversity. So again, isn't that what has been seducing us once more as architects? Can architecture transform, but not out of formalist, aesthetic sort of devices, even though we are all pursuing a kind of poetic act through our work, but out of really socioeconomic contingencies. And this is in fact what we've been ignoring, or we are unable to really understand, to inform how architecture ultimately could frame ambiguity possibly, or could support these non-conforming conditions. So while that is a condition, now let me show you the main conflict that we have unearthed out of these dynamics. And it is the conflict between factories, labor, and emergency housing in Tijuana. This has been the very specific conflict. Of course, there are many, but this is the one that we decided to center on, to realize that many of the maquiladoras being placed in Tijuana are being placed around the slums, whether the mini master plan communities or the actual informal settlements, because they can extract labor very easily without giving anything back in return. So one very first realization was that as factories out of NAFTA were getting cheap labor from the slums around them, can these factories give something in return, even if it is a very minimal gesture, but hopefully for maximum effect? Can the production and material systems of these factories be retrofitted to produce micro-infrastructure that can support some of the precariousness and help to inject certain organizational tactics into these environments has been essential. So these factories, of course, they are not pressured by the municipality of Tijuana, because if they tax them or ask for anything, these factories will pack their bags, as they say, and go to China. So I think there is something to say about the slum is not the site of intervention, but we have to go to the factory, and the factory is the site actually of encroachment, where we negotiate these systems. So we came to a factory in Tijuana called Mechalux. We first began with the Hyundai, but we realized that the Hyundai had its chassis was too heavy for this frame that we wanted to build. And we came to Mechalux, which is a Spanish maquiladora, and I tried to play this sort of guilt trip, the colonizers guild. And so we talked to the CEO of this factory, and he was open to allow the construction of a series of frames that would be produced out of the light alteration of their assembly plant. And we produced a series of frames. This is one which would be a device, a kind of hinge mechanism, to be given to families at the time of invasion and probably allow the kind of organization of space and of stitching all of this waste. Because part of the problem in this case is that the first rainy season, there is incredible washing away of housing as housing is placed in the course of the watershed. So after talking to some people about it, people who import some of these garage doors, contractors that have been doing this for 25 years, some of the people living in these environments, we realized that we could produce this frame accompanied by a catalog that could in fact help to stitch some of these waste in a more coherent, at times safe, secure way, and allow a kind of temporal transitional system that could probably in the end organize what ultimately would be a larger scaffold. So these temporal dynamics, I mean, a lot of people actually tell me, you know, in terms of criticism, who are you to suggest that these people want to live among so much trash? They would be the first ones, in fact, that would love to live in one of those McMansions in San Diego. And the first answer that I can come up with is that, well, tell me when are they going to be able to live in a McMansion? Of course, that's what they want, but when? So what do we do in the meantime? So I think that we as architects also could address the kind of temporal transitional systems that would allow the support of some of these dynamics that are unavoidable, they are happening anyway. How can we inject some of these support systems to produce a very different idea of housing? Because here housing is not a series of objects designed in a crafted, minimalist way that can be published into a magazine. I mean, this is a housing urbanism made of waste. So these conditions of collectivities and individuals and systems of negotiation across boundaries and resources becomes an incredible lesson. So while waste goes southbound, people go north in search for dollars. And this has been probably the most important aspect of our research and work, the inspiration of the impact of immigration as immigrants begin to transform the very nature of the American neighborhood. So we've been trying to collect a series of stories of encroachment. Been working on a sketch project that really is trying to collect these sort of invisible dynamics in examples, real examples of what people have encroached into the missed opportunities offered by urbanization to produce other types of equity, of public space or public domain. So mapping non-conformity, 3 stories of encroachment. The first one is an urbanism 70 feet deep, or the tunnel house, as we begin to notice, of course, that after 9/11, exactly look at this image of the border and the river colliding almost tangentially in the checkpoint right there at that intersection between the political and the natural. But 40 illegal tunnels have been dug beneath Homeland Security since 9/11, connecting houses to parking lots and churches to warehouse on both sides of the border. I would love to read to you some of the narratives that the Homeland Security has produced when they have discovered these tunnels, because all of the tunnels are different, of course, for different purposes, and they have to create these narratives to explain what is the meaning of the infrastructure. They are incredibly surreal. But as we begin to see how these tunnels pierce, again, this formidable barrier, connecting and transgressing this barrier, we begin to notice, of course, the impact of these informal social economic dynamics and densities and economies. But the most incredible fact is, of course, that they, in fact, are connecting the fabric between these 2 cities, again, between churches, houses, factories, and parking lots. The last tunnel that was discovered recently was huge. It was 2 ways. It had electricity, water extraction, and air extraction systems. And ultimately, it was very surreal because while the cartel the drug cartel that commissioned this tunnel, probably to an engineer, hopefully not a SCI-Arc student, to build it, while they would not use it for the transference of drugs, they would lease it to coyotes crossing people. And I always thought that this was the most surreal part of it. This was the first mixed-use tunnel across the border. So this idea, again, of the impact of informal economies and flows are very interesting, but the story that we would like to construct is the first tunnel that was dug from a house next to the checkpoint connecting to a parking lot where a van would park, and out of a manhole they would transfer people. This is the tunnel house, which now has been purchased by a couple of artists and activists, Luis Duarte and Adolfo Nodal from Los Angeles, in fact, have now transformed, as Luis calls it, the house with bad reputation into a cultural center for the neighborhood. So there is an amazing story of transformation here. The second story that we've been focusing on, which is important very much to the practice, is the nature of the leftover as the site of the informal in the next decades. Compendium of voice, a chronology of an invasion. What would occur if we were to erase the city of San Diego and we would just leave the archipelago of leftover spaces? And of course, it's not only vacant spaces in terms of private dilapidated property. I'm talking about all the missed opportunities, physical environments, from the watershed to the canyons to many spaces that really have produced this archipelago, again, of voice. But what I noticed recently was that it's not only the physicality of these environments that are usually taken out of, through a very metaphorical projects by artists or architects, but when we were ignoring that this compendium of voice was also mirrored by a compendium of leftover policies, invisible municipal assets that we have been ignoring. I mean, of course, maybe the most emblematic of them is Paper Street. Do you know what a paper street is? For some of you who work in Los Angeles. Well, a paper street is a street that was registered as a street, but was never built. Because sometime in the 50s, I don't know when, out of the downtown's office of planning, when the planners were playing with markers, building this grid that then was abstractly imposed on the topography. When they finally got to that place, they realized that they could not build that street because of the topographic complexity. So that street was never built, and it's called Paper Street. So there is a political process to transform this paper street into private property. It's called a street vacation. I'm telling you, all the conceptual material is in the code, as we've been noticing, of course. So any private owner that has a property next to a paper street can go through a process of claiming that street. And if no neighbor complains, that street can become private property, making his or her lot parcel larger. Imagine so much wasted public assets that we as architects could begin to triangulate. So as we realize that there is an invisible imprint of setbacks, easements, paper streets, canyons, watersheds, it's important that we notice them with different eyes. Let me now focus on a couple of these islands of these voids. Instead of looking at the leftover as a unitary condition, in other words, as just one piece, as a singular piece, usually we would look at a vacant site on its own. We created an exercise where we just looked at a network of leftover spaces that are adjacent to each other. Let's look at the adjacencies. Then let's eliminate the physicality for a moment of this environment, and let's inquire what is next to these leftover spaces. We found out that, that triangular empty parcel that you see there, the warehouse next to it, we found out after we went to knock on the door, because these are large industrial buildings that look like fortresses. We knocked on the door and we found out that it was one of the most important skateboard companies in the world, right there in the middle of this poor neighborhood. Two parcels next to it, a church where a senior center functions, where a group of young artists collaborate to photograph the neighborhood, an elementary school less than a block away, Chicano Park with a lot of resources. In other words, the task in this case was not only to look at the physicality of the leftover, but the possible triangulation of these resources. The task of the designer becomes one of consolidating these fragments of budgets, pedagogies or curricula, and the leftover. So this triangulation again begins to suggest how to probably transform the value of some of these environments. I mean, look at this one. Look at the shape. Do you know what this is? This is a paper freeway. So there's not only paper streets, but freeways that were never built, and they produce these leftover environments. You can see the informal trails connecting environments. But of course, what flanks these environments again are community-based NGOs, schools, all these agencies that are ignoring each other. They are invisible to themselves because they are trying to just subsist. And so part of this idea in realizing that we need to understand where the resources are, who owns the resources, and how they can be reorganized. let me finish this story with the most compelling of them all probably so far, which is the one that I'm trying to trace. A few years ago, a group of teenagers, this is my homage to Antonio Negri and the multitude, invaded an underpass in the freeway near my house in the intersection of Washington Street and Freeway 5. And they began to dig. You know, they said, you know, we're tired, there is no skateboard parks here. They went to Home Depot, they organized in the middle of the night with shovels. They went to dig to begin the construction of their own skateboard park. They were stopped by the police a few weeks later. They were told that they needed to organize themselves. They were teenagers. They hired a lawyer possibly. And the first task that they had to really understand was to recognize the power imprinted in that intersection where they began to dig. They were lucky, one of them told me as we were tracing this story, because they didn't dig in Caltrans territory. They were lucky. It would have been impossible to produce what they ended up producing. They dug just next to Caltrans territory, but nevertheless had a very interesting triangle of the Bermudas in terms of jurisdiction that nobody wanted to claim. They were in the middle of Port Authority territory, of Airport Authority, of two city districts, and of Pacific Coast Highway Review Board. They had to recognize the power that was imprinted in that territory. The next was to begin organizing themselves as skaters and to really contact city officials. They had to engage the city attorney's office, the city council, two of them that really were in between this territory, parks and rec departments. They began to actually form an NGO. The city told them the only way to negotiate with you is that you form an NGO. They organized themselves. They created their bylaws. They began to understand the budget that were fragmented across these stupid departments in the planning, you know, city departments, how to consolidate them into assets that they could then produce. All of this plethora, all this landscape of relations across political and economic power, the skateboards understood. They negotiated themselves into the process. Look at this. They were able to ultimately get this space from the city. They are leasing the space for 1 cent a year and ultimately build their skateboard park. They also relied on collaborations from Seattle, where they found out that these guys were doing this. People in Seattle came to help to build it. This is when the project became really phenomenological as opposed to political, because they were actually designing the curvature of these concrete environments and designing the structure that would connect them to the columns and so on. But what I'm trying to say here, again, is obvious. Again, that no intervention into the territory can occur without understanding conditions of power, economic and political. And it is those conditions that become the material to redefine the city. The final story in this context is called Levittown Retrofitted, Non-Conforming Buddha. And of course, if we were to render a land use map of the border, which does not exist, imagine that. At the busiest border in the world, not one single transborder planning entity, no one single border authority that could anticipate the growth of these two cities in tandem or in relationship to each other. But if we were to speculatively build the land use map between the two cities, and by the way, I could say to some of you in SCI-Arc that these drawings are not that sophisticated, and that's what I'm trying to get at, is that we need to be more direct with our stories. We cannot continue to hide behind this very complex, this fake complexity in a sense of these diagrams that are as interesting as they are in understanding artistic process. They keep us so far away from the political discussion in terms of remaking the city. So when I, in a lyrical way, begin to understand that the illegal zoning of Tijuana, or the high pixelation of the zoning of Tijuana, begins to seep into San Diego, begins to deposit itself in some of the older neighborhoods, transforming the homogeneity of those environments. This encroachment of illegal zoning that is retrofitting the large swatches of zoning conditions in San Diego with small. This is particularly an interest of mine. And of course, to realize that out of that process, we continue just to focus on two environments in the contemporary city. One, the return to downtown with a very expensive, as of maybe a few weeks ago, project of gentrification made of the same economic recipes of luxury condos, stadiums, and the franchise that surround them. And on the other end, an equally expensive project of infrastructure. It used to be that the periphery or the suburbs were the alternative in terms of affordability. Now the project is equally as expensive. The space that we continue to ignore is the environment in between. The older neighborhoods, the mid-city, the first ring of suburbanization, where in fact most of these diasporas have been settled in the last 30, 40 years, unable to afford, in fact, the expensive rents of downtown and the high prices of real estate in the periphery, while conveniently serving as the service communities to feed these projects of power, economic power. So let's imagine that this mid-city, this first ring of suburbanization looked like this after the war, a typical levee town. See, it's not that different than the new suburbs now. I mean, these levee towns were smaller. Now the suburbs are in steroids, but it's the same logic. Homogeneity, this cookie cutter, individual house and individual lots. In the last 30, 40 years, this homogeneity has been pierced, altered, encroached into, pixelated by informal economies and densities, by immigrants, including the non-conforming Buddha, which in fact is the story of a house of the 50s, a bungalow that has been transformed in the last 15 years into a Buddhist temple. And what is interesting is that here, the Buddhist temple transformed not only the typological kind of organization of the house, but it produces agency. The Buddhist temple, in this case, produces levels of sociability in the neighborhood, economic alternative relations, pedagogical projects, and so on. Let's imagine that if the first ring of suburbanization was transformed so radically in the last 30, 40 years, would the third, fourth, fifth ring of suburbanization will go through the same fate, and in 60 years, some of the Mac mansions being built in the periphery of San Diego would have to be retrofitted to accommodate difference. As these houses might be subdivided into 3 units in a small business, we actually, in a playful, conceptual way, we produced this installation in the San Francisco Art Institute called Mac Mansion Retrofitted, where we stole an idea from Artism. It's a non-stop city, and we constructed these mirror balls of the non-stop sprawl, because even though the kind of energy crisis is really in front of us, I don't think these attitudes will change that drastically. So part of the idea, of course, is how do we understand that the future of Southern California is really depending on the pixelation of the large by the small, and the transformations of this wasteful, selfish urbanism, not only in terms of spatial bricolage stuff that I don't want to be responsible for. What I'm trying to say is that the project here is about rethinking ownership, a very different size of ownership, not only about challenging the paradigm of the American dream of individual houses and individual lots, but in some communities this cannot be afforded. To rethink ownership, to rethink other alternatives of ownership is an important issue. So we continue to be pressed and in the middle of this polarity between style and form, the kind of aesthetic, formalist project of architecture, and our inability to understand the actual processes, social, political, and economic, that are transforming the city. So our practice, again, as I've been showing, oscillates between the strategies of the informal and the politics of zoning in San Diego and Tijuana. In San Diego, the project becomes exactly the pixelation, again, of the large with the small. I mean, this is the capital of oil-hungry urbanization, right? And we continue to hide it behind these empty policies that look at green practices as a way of camouflaging an incredibly selfish, faulty policy that continues to be perpetuated. So as long as we do not challenge the policies, the actual economic recipes that are producing this sterile urbanism, we are not going to advance any notion of sustainability, even if high technology or expensive technology dresses up this humongous urbanism with responsibility. So the idea of triangulation between environmental degradation, political degradation, and socioeconomic degradation, of course, all summarized by the last 8 years of stupid government, is really what defines the terms. We cannot ignore that triangulation. Environmental sustainability cannot exist without social and economic sustainability to close the socioeconomic gap. And when this, of course, hits the territory, when global conflict hits the territory, it is, of course, producing these scars of how sociopolitical and economic strife is manifested in the territory. It cannot get any more physical than in Darfur, of course. But I would argue that while the first world continues to blame the third in terms of conflict, those scars are equally as humongous and dramatic in the first world as this. I don't know if you remember this cover in the New York Times, this huge crater in this city outside Beijing, where they're going to build, of course, a very huge tower, a huge project. They have left only one house of the old neighborhood that used to be there. And this is a woman that is protesting. This is in China, right? So whoever said that the top-down and the bottom-up struggles is not alive and well, here it is, physically manifested. Top-down and bottom-up tensions as these conditions continue to be perpetuated. And of course, in our very country, the tensions between immigration, labor, and urbanization. I mean, since when urbanization is not shaped by immigrant labor, from Dubai to New York to San Diego or Los Angeles? So for every mega project of redevelopment that is incredibly wealthy, again, up until very few weeks ago, I tell you I have to throw away this PowerPoint very soon. For each of these mega projects of redevelopment, there is a project of marginalization that is produced, and it is a service community that is needed to support this project. Where do they live? What impact, what role do they have in shaping the very different socioeconomic agenda is very important. So the triangulation of density, social and economic networks is at stake as it has been. This is nothing new. Every single summit from the UNESCO to the Tokyo Accord concludes for the last decades in the same sentence, that the advancement of the contemporary city depends on the triangulation of density, housing, affordability, social and ecological networks. What is housing is at stake is the main issue that has been preoccupying our small practice in San Diego. You remember this image from West 8? So many of the new students remember this image? Because I'm taking, sorry, a long time, but I mean, this image was fundamental when I saw it 10 years ago, I think, or 8 years ago. West 8, an office of planning and landscape architect from the Netherlands, was asked by the Netherlands Architecture Institute to produce an installation to convey to the general public in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, the housing deficit in the next 20 years in the Netherlands amounted to 800,000 units. What did the landscape architects do? They didn't draw complex diagrams or research, and they actually said, why not to build the 800,000 little units and throw them in the museum floor to convey to the general public that if we continue to perpetuate this Levittown on steroids, housing that is indifferent to public social infrastructures, transportation, the whole rhetoric that we've been talking about, we are going to perpetuate this unsustainable project. So in my case, when I see these images, I realize that we need to find alternative procedures. My project has been centered in a neighborhood in San Diego called San Isidro, which is exactly next to the checkpoint on the US side. It's called San Isidro, collaborating with a very progressive social service, community-based grassroots organization called Casa Familiar, to suggest that a new paradigm of housing, of affordability, of ownership, a very different process of economic and political relevance could emerge out of collaboration between non-profits and governments and communities. So these non-profits based in these neighborhoods where all these mutations have been happening can become the informal city halls, the producers of a very different idea of housing. So what is density? Of course, continues to be the question. We have to figure out how to re-engage the community workshops. Because I didn't want, after being at SCI-Arc, I didn't want to become so provincial, right? And go back to the community as we have been going as architects just to listen to what people want and just draft that for them. We needed to problematize the debate with communities. It's not that they want a Spanish colonial bungalow, or if it is a Chicano community, the building has to look like an Aztec pyramid. It's more than style. It's really about the operational against sociopolitical and economic agenda. So this lady told us that density is complexity, that in fact density might be neighborhood collaboration. Isn't it amazing that all over the world, these are images from the last Venice Biennial, not the recent one, but the 2 years ago, the most advanced experimental centers of knowledge like SCI-Arc and the Verlaje continue to perpetuate. The density is just an abstract equation of an amount of units per acre. After working in this neighborhood, I realized that this is the first thing that we need to shatter, that we need to rethink modes of representation of the city. Can density be thought differently? Can density be thought instead as an amount of socioeconomic exchanges per acre? This is the conditions. Let me show you, and I'm getting very close to the end. Let me show you, and I will benefit from I will indulge in your patience because I wanted to, coming back to SCI-Arc, give you the whole enchilada, as they say. While that is a condition, the conflict that I unearthed, that I revealed, exposed with my client, the nonprofit organization CEO, Andrea Scoretta, was the conflict between lending, mortgages, and zoning. We began to question, wait a minute, in the last 10 some years of incredible successful construction boom in San Diego, unprecedented, luxury condos everywhere. Not one single affordable housing project has been built in some of these depressed communities. So why? Why is that? Why would that be the case? Well, we realize that for any private developer to make it profitable, again, as you know, the show is run by private developers in the absence of political will here. For a private developer to make it profitable to build an affordable housing project in many of these communities, this private developer would have to take advantage of tax credits or subsidies to make it profitable. To take advantage of tax credits or subsidies, which in this country, they are competitive, this project would have to be at least 50 units in density. Well, guess what? 50 units are prohibited by zoning in those neighborhoods. So there is a catch-22 between zoning and lending. So what do I do as an architect? Do I subordinate myself to the whims of the developer that hands me a pro forma that will benefit particular economies? Design the best looking building I can, camouflage these conditions of privatization, unable to make sense of what is going on, or I face or enter head on this conflict? Can we rethink other modalities of lending? Can we rethink other conditions of zoning? I realized at that point, of course, as all of you know, that the city and the idea of city for all of us in this country is driven by the power of economic capital only. Economic value is the seed, is the only seed, in fact, of development in the city. I have to read quickly those yellow bubbles. I don't know if they are clear, they know. Okay, I had to talk about top-down institutions. What makes private development? For a private developer, the project is market-owned. And as we saw recently, that has its own negative, conditions. The economic framework for this project: maximum units, minimum public infrastructure. The economic framework: large loans, individual profits. The policy framework: maximum amount of units, minimum public infrastructure. And the social framework: the dweller is a customer. This is a conception of the dweller as a customer. I had to juxtapose that to my experience with Casa Familiar, because for this neighborhood, again, becoming the laboratory of our work, we have been talking about how it's not the city, the laboratory of contemporary culture, it's really the neighborhood where we find some of these progressive social agencies at play. Here, it is the power of social capital that counts. That cultural and social value could be the device to create alternative markets and economies. For a community bottom-up agency, the notion of the development, it is not market-owned, it's neighborhood-owned. The economic framework is microcredits and maximum, of course, community profits, the community profits. The policy framework: density equals an amount of social and economic exchanges per acre. And the social framework, which is the most relevant for me, is that the dweller is not a customer, generic customer, is a participant. And the value of participation in volunteerism has been undervalued, undermined, or ignored, basically. The hidden value of policy, a micro-policy, and an economic framework that could make these two small projects sustainable. So we produced and presented to the city of San Diego, to the municipality of San Diego, what we ended up calling a micro-policy for the neighborhood. The neighborhood as a political unit, very popular idea in the 60s, is coming back. The neighborhood as a site of exception. Can an NGO produce a very different idea of equity? So we presented 3 roles for the nonprofit that is based in this neighborhood. One, that the NGO, Casa Familiar, will become the think tank. I mean, it is already think tank. What we have been ignoring is the intelligence of these ground-up dynamics as an inspiration to rethink policy. So the think tank, which is the NGO, offered to the municipality that they would map all illegal constructions in the neighborhood. Imagine that, mapping non-conformity. And that the city would authorize them, would change the zoning into an affordable housing overlay zone. That was the first role, to record and map the non-conforming and to suggest that in a humongous parcel with one house, 3 other houses or units could coexist in a small business. At that point, the owner of some of these parcels that they have owned for years, but they don't have any money, they barely speak English, the owner could be brought in as a micro-developer To avoid gentrification, what do we do, right? That's a big question. So instead of going to the municipality to apply for permits to rebuild these decorative units in the back of their houses, the owner comes to the nonprofit. So the city gives the power to the nonprofit to facilitate construction permits. That was an incredible advancement in the whole idea. That plans would be drawn of units that could be reconfigured in different ways, but the municipality would authorize them, would pre-approve them, and the NGO would facilitate the final permit. And of course, here is where sweat equity, voluntarism, and participation can be translated into a number that a bank will never accept, but the NGO takes liability, right? So in this case, the owner agrees in participating in the construction. We forget that here's where the service sector lives, in the construction of some of these units. And of course, the NGO becomes a translator of that invisible sweat equity or social capital into value, economic value. And the final role was that an NGO would facilitate microloans by shattering the 50-unit construction loan that is determined by the recipes of subsidies of tax credits to benefit private developers. Breaking them apart into individual 50 microloans, it can be sprinkled through the neighborhood to then create a very different idea of densification. If you have noticed the diptych, institutional and agency collaboration on one hand generates a microurbanism of resources and spaces at the scale of the neighborhood. And of course, what was yielded or what was produced out of this micropolicy, understanding that housing couldn't be continued to be perpetuated just as individual units that could be owned or rented, that in fact these units needed to be plugged with socioeconomic support systems emerging from the programming, cultural, economic, and social of these nonprofit organizations. That's the main issue, in summary, really, of what has been fundamental for our practice, is to rethink those relationships and that the nonprofit could become a developer. So we produced two projects, one which is the senior housing with childcare over there in living rooms at the border at the bottom. In the last 6 years, we've been trying to fight to get this project built. Finally, in the next 2 years, we hope to do it finally. Now that we have come back to the negotiating table with the municipality, and we have aligned some of the economy behind it. So the senior housing project, I will not go into it, but again, how the units are pixelated with a variety of support systems, equal to the living rooms at the border, which I think I should quickly just tell you in the way of its composition, because it's not only the micropolicy, but how alternative spatial configurations should support that micropolicy, right? To support the informal economies as well. So we thought of a project that could be layered conceptually. A parcel with an existing church and a very small parcel, in fact, that we decided we were going to send a message that a very small project could be catalytic to anticipate very different ideas of density and mixed use in the city of San Diego. We began to notice how people move through parcels in this very poor neighborhood, from alley to parcel to street. We began to realize that probably one first task was to not think of the building, but think of the parcel as a system that could really be made of intertwining, interrelated spaces that could support sociability and economic opportunity. So the whole parcel, let's imagine, it became an infrastructure, a kind of social service infrastructure that would be managed and that would be plugged with programming by the nonprofit organization to configure the parcel into a variety of social activities and economies throughout the month, throughout the year, etc. So simply the project is made of this garden from which, the transformation of the church, a garden, and the extrusion of these platforms or frames that have electricity, the frame, the garden, and the interior of the church become the infrastructure of support for this housing. And of course, the last layer is the housing itself. I can remember the face of Andreas Correpa when I told her that she was commissioned me to do housing. That was the last part of the stew. And so the housing at the end would be stitched through and above this frame, choreographing a variety, ultimately, of unit configurations. This is essential. The homogenization of performance by developers yields homogenization in terms of units. Can we rethink the composition of these units so that housing is not just shelter, it's a producer of things, it's a producer of economies. This has been essential. This is an example of this pixelation of the unit across a variety of modalities, not from San Isidro, but from a project that we are doing in New York near Hudson, where a lady told us that her 19-year-old son is a dancer, and he teaches dance to children in the neighborhood. He's a natural teacher, but he doesn't get anything in return. We thought this is a perfect example of how to plug this individual that already is participating and really transfer his social service into economic value, produce a space in the project where teaching could occur, and to negotiate the programming of the nonprofit with available resources that are fragmented to configure a way of allowing him to have free rent. This is the paradigm, of course, that we've forgotten. This is so much of the 60s, the co-op unit, of course, two artists sharing a mortgage, sharing a space to work, and ultimately being plugged into the community out of pedagogical projects, or the two ladies in San Isidro that shared a 3-bedroom apartment to transform it into a micro-nursery. Again, we have been undervaluing the meaning of social capital in producing alternative markets and economies. I thought that I was full of shit a few weeks ago, but after the market collapse, I'm telling you, this is becoming more evident and more essential that we address these dynamics. So the parcel then is pixelated, this infrastructure of ambiguity, of social service, which is not about people just building their architecture. I want to demystify that here at SCI-Arc as well. I'm not necessarily interested as much as I'm seduced by the informal aesthetics of these shantytowns. It's not just about people building their own bricolage. It's about how ambiguity can be injected with specificity. By that I mean the choreography of programming to modulate social encounter and economic possibility. So this parcel is then injected and pixelated by these different opportunities. And of course, at one point in the history of this project, we said, who is going to pay for the infrastructure of the garden, the church, and that frame? Tax credits do not pay for infrastructure. But later we found out that there was a very small type in the tax credit law that as long as we name these frames social service, essential for the social support of the housing project, we could qualify for tax credits. But at that point, in desperation, we just decided, why can't we call this frame art, public art? And then we can put the housing on top. And that's what initially we began to negotiate with the Arts and Culture Department in San Diego, who really was interested in that possibility. So this pairing of ambiguity and specificity is at stake in many of these projects. And for each specific program, there is this mirror in terms of producing available platforms for, again, social exchange and economy. I think that that's what Ignacio de Sola Morales referred to when he talked about the terrain back. Remember that incredible essay. It's not just about the leftover being reconfigured out of landscape accessibility. It's about light infrastructures that could anticipate future, again, sociability. So again, according to official zoning on this parcel in San Isidro, only 3 units of housing can be built. We presented to the municipality an NGO-managed housing prototype that has 12 units, 14 units of housing, a community garden, a mercado, a community space out of the alteration of the church, the NGO offices in the new attic of the church. Again, a very interesting mixture of uses. After all, it's all about that. That can produce a very different idea of social sustainability. I will not burden you with much more unless you tell me that I could, but this project probably is emblematic of some of these dynamics in a more tangible way. 25 artists joining forces to buy a property, becoming developers of their own housing and studios. 25 sheds that are very generic and cheap on top of an infrastructure of 2 levels of parking, and a surplus space all the way to the bottom of the combo to produce a gallery workshop space so that they could qualify for development monies in this neighborhood, and they interface with the community through pedagogical projects. So again, we could be developers of our own work. This has been a paradigm in San Diego. But what I'm trying to say is that the combination and recombination in the pro forma and the policies available begin to suggest very specific configurations of space. That's what I'm interested in, because I'm an architect after all. I want to build an architecture that is reflective of these possibilities. And of course, this is what is going on in our project in Hudson, New York, where we've been engaging a variety of housing prototypes supported by a foundation called PARC, based in New York City, where we came to New York to Hudson, a very kind of suburban environment, even though Hudson is really more like a city, 2 hours away from New York, to realize that the same problems exist between wealth and poverty and the lack of housing affordability. And we are producing a project, I will not go through it that much, but taking advantage of wasted spaces, easements, we created this linear park that connected a very depressed street to the back with a gentrified street. This is amazing, 2 blocks from each other, poverty and wealth in the city. And along it, a series of appropriations of, in fact, parcels that are owned by the city because they've been transformed into parking lots, huge retaining walls, a typical stupid planning that, bulldozers some of these fabrics. And along this spine, a series of infrastructural spaces, again, to house incubator spaces that can be managed by some of the very progressive NGOs in Hudson. And through these platforms, a series of different types of economies or housing configurations. These are some of the examples. Again, I don't want to go deep into but probably the most emblematic of them all is this one here, where we, one of the parcels had an existing community garden. And we said, why not to really look into place a community garden, because they were just leasing the land for a while. Let's make it part of the project, let's leave it there for perpetuity, and let's wrap it with senior housing and a winter garden so that they could be the caretakers of the garden. So these combinations, cross-subsidy across these projects begin to shape the fabric of very different, again, this is the challenge of developers, how to, in one block, produce a frame, in fact, different economies, different social compositions, and ultimately different types of scales. I think that is paradigmatic. So in this process of alteration, to finalize, this adaptation and retrofitting of some of these environments out of very light transitional spaces have been of interest to me. I've been very lucky to work with Mike Davis, who used to teach here at SCI-Arc, to transform his beige, typical mid-city, garage into a very small and very light unit that is illegal, in fact. It's bringing back, the typology of the sleeping porch. So the garage was transformed into Mike Davis's office, and by creating very tactically spaces that are interstitial, a bathroom that is outdoors, a sleeping porch and a unit, we create the infrastructure for probably this small garage to stand on its own once the zoning might change, to allow this to become an independent unit. So this is, again, he calls it my shanty, but it is this very small piece on top of the garage. And of course, they have very light materials that are framing some of these spaces. And one that was a lot of fun to work with was a commission that we received. Again, I'm very interested in the thinking of new categories for zoning. How can we encroach into parking lots, into wasted, again, leftover spaces with temporal programming that can transform some of these missed opportunities. So we were commissioned by Insight, which is a binational art project in Tijuana, San Diego, where they invite 25 artists from all over the world to intervene in 2 cities. It's the only project that maybe transgresses the border, in a sense, with a cultural project. So we proposed to the curator to participate in the production, with the budget of the event, a production of a house, a framed house, that could then be transferred into Tijuana and occupying maybe the mama of all parking lots in San Diego, which is a parking lot in front of the museum, San Diego Museum of Art in Balboa Park. So believe me, it was more difficult to get a permit to build these than to cross the border illegally. This was unbelievable to deal with many of these permitting agencies and review boards and all of that. Literally, it was a tent with a house and a yard to create this alternative, portable public space of sorts that was transferred out of these truck beds and retrofitted with very poor materials in terms of, again, producing a variety of environments that would record and document some of the processes behind the interventions in Tijuana, San Diego. It's a kind of portable library of sorts. And of course, the house, the idea was that it would be, its material would be transferred at the end of the project. Let me finalize now with maybe the last project that we did last summer, as we were invited to participate with the Lisbon Biennial. And actually, I see that my friend Goyo Ortiz, who had been part of my studio for many years, is here now. He's getting a master's in UCLA, and he was essential part of all of this work. So thank you, Goyo, but particularly this one, because we traveled to Lisbon together. It was an opportunity to suggest that we could transfer one street culture into another. The biennials theme, the leftover void, the urban void, in the contemporary city, right? So we were trying to maybe project a message that much of these leftover spaces in the contemporary city are being and have been for centuries being plugged with informal economies. That the pairing of informal economy and leftover space is essential. So we thought, why not to do what we've been wanting to do for a while? I said to Goyo, why not to invite our favorite taco cook from Tijuana to go to Lisbon to produce a kitchen in a leftover space in a very particular neighborhood that we would choose. And let's get there with a very low budget that these biennials offer, enough to pay Goyo's ticket, my ticket, and Victor's, the taco guy, ticket, go to Lisbon and begin to knock on doors in this neighborhood and to prove that we can assemble a kitchen with the collaboration of others. And let's do it far away from the headquarters of the biennial in this neighborhood. So it was advertised as food for thought, the Tijuana-Lisbon kitchen. And here's Victor leaving Tijuana en route to Lisbon the first time that he left Tijuana. We were lucky that the first night we met Manuel, an ex-journalist, incredibly sharp, very versed in the theories of the Luz and the political kind of discourses of Lisbon. And he fell in love with the idea. He fell in love with Victor. He really liked this. We had traveled to Lisbon to cook. He invited him to cook in his restaurant and was advertised in the TV. So the whole Mexican colony came to this restaurant, to eat tongue with green sauce. This is the menu. Lingua de vaca, cooked by Victor Alonso, the emeritus taquero from Tijuana, Mexico. I thought that was an added value to the project. And then, of course, these relations with these people, which were amazing for Victor, began to take us in directions to find the material. Where are we going to? I was freaking out that we were not going to get avocados. And so we found this place in the outskirts of Lisbon where they sold Mexican produce that were imported to Portugal. And here is Victor very sadly looking at the frozen guacamole that was imported from Mexico City. But of course, Manuel took us to some of the best markets in the city. This was the best way, by the way, of really getting to know a place. And we began to assemble, of course, the food. We realized that we were going to make the most paradigmatic, popular taco, the carne asada taco. That's all we could do. But we said, can we also do a taco that is an homage to Lisbon? And we found out that that week when we were going to do this was the week of St. Anthony, and they do sardines, grilled sardines. So we basically produced the first sardine taco in the world there. And so here we are, Victor, meeting the people that allow us to use the kitchen to assemble this pretty much scaffold that a painter, friend of somebody, produced. So all these people came to collaborate, and we, of course, produced the kitchen in this leftover space. The idea was to exchange ideas for food, where people would fill out this voucher, writing a kind of thought about what is the role of the leftover in the contemporary city, and exchange it for a taco. Of course, these ideas about food and space and collaborative art practices are so fashionable right now. But nevertheless, it's a very powerful, I think, idea that we've been forgetting. That people themselves are the material. That social relations, in fact, could be the material to produce a new kind of relational landscape across human beings, but also about very alternative types of spaces. So in Mexico City, we produced a huge mural where we documented the story. Out of this map, you can see how Guillermo's arrows have been everywhere in the presentation. But again, some of the writings was really amazing. Some of the homeless that were near the park wrote probably some of the most compelling statements about the leftover. Of course, imagine that a homeless person that came to get a taco wrote what Ignacio de Sola Morales concluded in his essay of Terra and Back, that the leftover space is a space of desire in the contemporary city. So these postcards and this map was exhibited in Mexico City. Ultimately, again, in summary, is that what has been of inspiration to me is to suggest that at the border here, in this ecology between not only, it's not only San Diego, he's here, you as well in Los Angeles, that we must engage in urbanism primarily at the Batista, that transcends the property line. An urbanism where we as designers could be not only designers of objects, but really designers of alternative policy and economies, designers of collaboration. I mean, a fundamental text by Nicolas Goriot called Relational Aesthetics, very inspirational for me in the last years, suggests that we could be the designers and promoters of collaboration. But of course, this would require the coexistence, of course, with the contradictory. And I don't want to sound incredibly, I already have politicized maybe too much this lecture, but I remember when the Democratic Convention happened very recently, and I was so charged. I mean, the feeling that I got was, okay, let's get to work. But the most amazing definition of the political is the ability to decide the direction and purpose of action. Sigmund Bauman recently wrote, I think it cannot be more clear. I'm not trying to say that I want to be a politician and not a designer. It's forever, has been, this polarization has been perpetrated. I think we all need to be ready to work, and hopefully next Tuesday will be a beginning of a new era. Thank you very much. Telenovela, I'm sorry, but I had to share all the bits and pieces of the story to some of you, mainly coming back to SCI-Arc, and I know that maybe you are bored to death, but if you have any questions, I would appreciate the shattering of these thoughts by your commentary. Yes, Senor. Thank you. Bill is a figure at SCI-Arc, and I'm so happy to see him again. Thank you. Any questions? Duncan, you're here. Did you get here on time? No, the last 5 minutes, I know it, as usual. You're the worst Latin American I know. Yes.
I love the whole tenor of your talk. It really moves me. I think it's exactly what is needed, and I think your heart is exactly where an architect's heart should be. But that said, I have a question.
Yes.
You had a slide on the screen, and you showed the two basic models of development. One was top-down, the developer-driven model, and the other one was bottom-up, which was the more aesthetic, intuitive, spiritual kind of model. We all know that the top-down model is prevalent, and it's all over the place, and we're surrounded by it. But not in any way to challenge or put doubt on your ideals, but can you name any explicit examples of the bottom-up model empirically that's worked in the world today for more than a few years before it fizzles out?
Fantastic, fantastic. I mean, part of this issue of translation that I was mentioning, that the task of many schools of architecture should be translate what already has happened into new types of procedures. We're not reinventing anything new. I mean, I think we should notice that already very compelling projects are occurring in the global south. This has been an interest of mine, but if I was an octopus and a little bit more organized, I would like to do all that. This is what we are trying to do in San Diego by setting up this think tank. To go to Curitiba, for example. I know that a lot of people talk about Curitiba. Do you know about Curitiba, right? As an incredible example, many books about it, but usually we just focus on the product. How beautiful this park is, how wonderful these elevated stations are, but I haven't seen one single book that translates the procedures that negotiated across top-down and bottom-up. Jamie Lerner was actually interested in understanding a very different idea. Jamie Lerner, the ex-mayor of Curitiba, a very different idea of infrastructure emerging from the bottom-up, from certain social activism at times, but without polarizing it, because he needed, of course, the top-down economic power, negotiating with the Volvo company to retrofit its buses, to transfer some logics of transportation systems that were very expensive into more low-tech devices and so on. So this constant negotiation, I'm not trying to polarize to say just, in fact, by the way, the formal or the bottom-up is not only useful for me because it's intuitive and spiritual, it's because there is an incredible, tangible, concrete economic logic that can really be at play. In fact, probably the most important example is the one that Hernando de Soto wrote in his book, The Mystery of Capital. even though I disagree a bit with Hernando de Soto in the way that he just says that we're going to solve the problems just by giving property titles to slum dwellers without any check and balance devices and so on. Anyway, the point is that he said at some point, Americans just want to go around the world imposing their ideas of democracy on everybody, but they are not telling us the whole truth, he said. The west coast of the United States was colonized by illegals, by squatters, by informal bottom-up dynamics, black markets. Washington himself called these people bandits. And then he says, how the hell these bandits became the revered American icons of the American dream, the pioneers? What happened between those conditions of illegality, of this bottom-up, and the transformation of that into institutions? To retrace those histories is part of the agenda. So while that could be philosophically and historically a broad subject, I think there are very specific examples across the Global South that we could begin to research. Curitiba is one, Bogotá is another one, projects in India that might offer different alternatives. But every locality, every cultural geography has its own process. So all I'm trying to say is that we need to figure it out. I mean, of course, I'm not just saying the bottom-up is the solution. I'm just convinced that in the next years, the aspect of social capital will be an important device to produce other alternatives of ownership. But we would also rely on the economic power of institutions and not try to polarize that. In fact, that act of negotiation is at the center of my inquiry. Any other questions? So, should we have a drink? I don't know if there's. Thank you very much.
Thank you.